Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick Sullivan. Thank you so much for making time today to join us at this INCITS webinar. Today, we hope to continue to unpack some of the lessons that you've already learned around the new ISO IEC standard 42005, which is focused exclusively on AI impact assessments. Now, as you've likely seen, the standard is very long. So in today's section, we won't necessarily be focusing on other clauses or annexes. We'll largely be focusing on clause 5, wherein we'll have an opportunity to talk about things that you'll want to consider as you're developing and initially implementing your AI impact assessments. That said, jumping right in, we'll see clause 5 is broken up into a structure of 12 subclauses. 12 subclauses that follow at a macro level, something very similar to what you're already familiar with your ISO management systems at a micro level, and that we have a built-in mechanism to plan, do, check, and act. We'll try to point out those sections as we do drive through the clauses. Nonetheless, getting started, Clause 5.1 says that as an organization, we need to develop a process for implementing and executing our AI impact assessments. Now, there is a general recognition that every organization's context is unique, and therefore the process you develop will be context specific. Nonetheless, we want you to include some common things or have common considerations associated with your specific internal influences like your organizational context, customer contractual obligations, things of that nature, and external factors as you've already developed, as you've built your stakeholders table through creating your, and Bill, hopefully we can strike that. Apologies for the mix up. Nonetheless, external factors will include things that we've likely already documented as part of developing our scoping and context statement. Now, after you've begun developing your process, the next thing that we'll want to do to ensure that we can execute that process consistently is to ensure that we've documented the process. But we'll see that documenting our impact assessment process should be done in such a way that we can make information about the process itself available to interested parties, whether those interested parties are internal or external stakeholders. Included in Clause 5.2 will be some guidance, some guardrails around things that we'll want to ensure are included in our thoughts around the documentation process. Things like input for various management reviews, which we'll talk about in a later subclause. Use cases for awareness raising and training. That is, it's one thing to let our users know that we have a process documented for AI impact assessments. It's another thing entirely to understand, to ensure that they understand, that is, when appropriate use cases will be brought to bear to execute our AI impact assessment. Once we've documented our process, the next step in this plan in Clause 5 is to ensure that we integrate our new process with other organizational management processes. As with everything else that we do with our ISO standards and our ISO management systems, 42001, your aims in particular, you'll want to ensure that you're not creating a process that operates in a silo and doesn't necessarily interact or support other business processes. Clause 5.3 is asking us to do the same thing, which is ensure that we think through how the organization, how your organization will integrate this new impact assessment process into existing organizational processes so that it can be just part of your living and breathing DNA. Next, the timing of our impact assessment. So we've ensured that we know we need an impact assessment. We've developed a process. We've integrated that process with other business processes in the organization. The next thing that we really need to consider is when we should execute an AI impact assessment. And generally, we'll think of two triggers for implementing the impact assessment. One will be a time-based trigger. One will be an event-based trigger. That is, we have organizational rhythms. We have traditional processes that we're executing internal to our organization that naturally lend themselves to executing the impact assessment. The second would be an event, again, a trigger that lets us know that we need to stop and think through the changes that we're about to make or the changes that are about to be made on our behalf. We need to stop and think through the potential harms, the potential impacts of that change. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in Clause 5. Nonetheless, we really need to be thinking about this now and ensure that it's built in, that it's baked in to the overall impact assessment process. Next, in clause 5.5, once we have developed the documentation and once we've gotten a solid vision for how we will implement 42005 RAI impact assessments in our organization, the next thing that we really need to do is ensure that we're clean on scoping. Now, just like with your aims, just like with your other management systems, clause 4, which is consistent across our management system standards, says that we really have to ensure that we understand scoping and context. Everything else that we execute, everything else that we think about will be driven from that initial vision, that initial clarification. Clause 5.5 of 42005 says that we need to do exactly the same thing. And that is, it's great that we've developed and documented a process that we can communicate with external stakeholders. We know when we'll execute. This doesn't mean anything if we aren't absolutely clear and document in high definition the boundaries around which we'll be executing the AI impact assessments. Again, clause 5.5 elicits that for us. It says we must define the scope of the AI impact assessment, including applicability and boundaries. That is, what are we actually evaluating when we begin executing the AI impact assessment itself? Now, you'll see a note as we think about the scope of the impact assessment, we need to understand that changes to a system component can and likely will have implications on the overall system. So we really want to think through potential impacts, through changes, and through triggering the initiation of our impact assessments. We want to think more holistically and more systemically. We really need to understand that a change in a single component will absolutely have downstream impacts in other places in our system and account for that as we're executing the impact assessments themselves. Once we've done that, we're at a position that we can ensure that we assign and delegate appropriate responsibilities. There's an old saying that if two or more people are accountable, no one is. And that is never more true than when it relates to ensuring that we're doing the right thing with evaluating potential harms. Now, in allocating our responsibilities, we'll see that relevant responsibilities really depend on a lot of different factors. We know scoping, we know context are important, but we also know that we need to have individuals that are responsible for ensuring the documentation is available, for liaising between independent departments that are relevant to ensure that we have appropriate information to execute the impact assessment, and then that we're distributing that information to the appropriate places inside and outside our organization. We need to ensure that we have designees that are appropriate for establishing approvals. We'll see that there are going to be instances wherein approvals are needed either because our monitoring has determined that we're operating out of bounds with certain metrics that we've selected, or because we simply need to approve and release the impact assessment for other organizations inside our organization. Now, the assignment of responsibilities should consider relevant experience. We don't necessarily want to delegate and assign responsibilities for sign-off to those users, those people inside our organization that don't necessarily have wherewithal to do the right thing each and every time. After we associate designees, after we complete the steps that we need to complete with allocating responsibilities, our next step is to ensure that we've established thresholds. Again, tying this back to our management systems, clause 9, we know that we need to be monitoring, which means that we need to have well-defined metrics that we're operating against so that, again, we can know if we're operating in bounds or out of bounds. Clause 5.7 says that we need to establish those thresholds for sensitive uses, restricted uses, and impact scales. That is, so that we know when we go in to evaluate and actually execute this impact assessment, if we're performing in such a way that corrective action, that mitigating action is actually needed. So clause 5.7 is very, very important, and as with everything else, will be extremely context specific. Now, you'll see in Appendix C that we've defined the benefits and harms taxonomy. I will say that as you're thinking about your thresholds, that benefits and harms taxonomy can give you a really solid structure to think around and think through. So reference that as needed. Now, some other considerations we'll see listed in 5.7 might include applicable legal agreements. Do we have contractual obligations? Do we have regulatory obligations that we need to consider? Is someone else telling us what these thresholds need to be for our performance? Cultural, labor, and societal norms, depending on the area, the context in which we're operating. Do we have sensitivity? Do we have cultural norms that we need to ensure, again, that we're protecting through the use of this AI system or systems? In clause 8, we'll see that the housekeeping is finally done. So we've determined that we have to create an AI impact assessment process. We've determined that documentation of that process is necessary, what that should look like. We've determined that we need to have appropriate accountabilities around sign off for various things associated with the AI impact assessment, that we need to integrate the AI impact assessment with other organizational processes. So again, we've done all the housekeeping that we need to do. In clause 5.8, we finally come to the point that we're ready to perform the AI impact assessment. Now, what we need to know from clause 5, what we need to know from developing and designing the impact assessment itself is, as we said before, we need to execute in such a way that we're considering identification of reasonable, and I'll just highlight this so that we can get the wording appropriate, reasonable foreseeable AI system impacts. That is the whole goal, is we want to ensure that as we are evaluating our system, that we're identifying reasonably foreseeable AI system impacts. Some other things that we might think about is how those impacts that we identify actually translate to organizational risk. This is a very big thing. We'll see in the appendices as well that we might have various types of impact assessments. In fact, you likely do today. Fundamental human rights impact assessments, data protection, data privacy impact assessments, AI impact assessments. These impact assessments essentially roll up to help us understand our AI system risk, which rolls up to help us understand our overall organizational risk. It's through clause 5.8 that we begin really thinking through making those connections so that we can think more systemically about the impact assessments themselves. In clause 9, after we've executed the AI impact assessment, after we've really driven that process, which we've already documented, the next thing that we need to think about is how we analyze the results of the impact assessment. Now, what you'll see in clause 5.9 is that we really want to take a couple different perspectives in our analysis. The first is a technical. So we've identified impacts, but we know that those translate to organizational risks, internal and external. So from a technical perspective, the question that we ask ourselves is, what do we do with that? Now that we know that these impacts, that these potential impacts are real, which means that the risks are very likely real and they're going to have some sort of impact, double use of the word, they're going to have some sort of potential downstream harm. We need to think about technically what controls we will employ to ensure that we're better prepared to protect internal and external stakeholders, interested party, against the harms that might be derived from those impacts actually being realized. Now, aside from the technical perspective, we'll also want to ensure that we think about our impact assessment from really a strategic perspective. What we'll see in clause 5.9 is referred to as the management level. And that is from a strategic perspective. We know that we have this impact assessment that's indicating currents, that's indicating themes that are present in and around our AI system. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, in context, is this indicative of something bigger? This is where, from a management perspective, we'll evaluate our impact assessment over time. If we do have multiple impact assessments to think through, we'll use that as a tool to, again, think more systemically, more strategically about potential harms that we can mitigate from the front end, potential changes that we can make to ensure that we're not constantly fighting little fires and protecting those users that are using our systems. Now, after that analysis, the next thing that we'll need to do is ensure that we are recording the results and then reporting those results again to interested parties. Those interested parties can be internal or external users. Every organization is different. But some of the things that we'll want to think about from a reporting perspective is internally the parties that we'll report to, and then externally, not just the parties that we might need to report to, but also those parties' ability to understand technical information. So in clause 5.10, we'll see that we have a real opportunity to think about creating an external report of our impact assessment that is receivable and digestible by less technical people. We'll also see that we have coaching that in those instances where we're making an impact assessment externally available, it becomes very, very important that we don't divulge sensitive information about our organization. And so we'll want to be very tactful with the information that's included in that external impact assessment while also remaining as transparent as possible. So definitely balance is needed here. As I mentioned before, we need to think through and we need to implement some sort of defined process for ensuring that we have approvals in place at various stages of the AI impact assessment. Approvals for what? We'll see instances where we are testing against our metrics, instances where if we find a particular metric performing out of range, we might necessarily want to stop the impact assessment and ask for an approval, a sign off to move forward in the process before begin mitigating, before taking action to address that particular concern. Regardless of how this plays out in your organization, what you'll want to ensure that you do is through the impact assessment process, ensure at least internally in this reporting chain and your accountability chain that you're being as transparent as you can possibly be. And if and when is potential for significant harms or significant issues, that you do have sign off to move forward through the process. Another consideration with sign offs is ensuring that we do have a sign off to say, yes, this particular assessment is complete. What we don't want to have are impact assessments that are continually running and never actually conclude. So think about, as an organization, having a mechanism to ensure that once results have been reviewed, once results have been validated, you can comfortably say, yes, this particular impact assessment is done complete. Let's begin waiting either for the next trigger through organizational rhythm or trigger through change in our environment. Lastly, monitoring and review. Just like with our management systems, as I said, clause 9, we need a mechanism to ensure that we're always planning, doing, checking, and acting. That is, we need a mechanism to ensure that we do have constant monitoring and review of the process. That process or that mechanism is called for in clause 512. And so through definition of our monitoring and review process, you'll see some of the things that we'll want to consider include determining when our impact assessments are performed. We saw this in an earlier clause. That is, again, either on an established cadence or triggered by some event, typically some change. Who performs the monitoring and review? Where does that particular accountability lie? Other decisions that we'll want to consider, continual improvement opportunities. Just as with everything else, the opportunity to continuously improve and drive forward our process to bring more efficiencies and more positive impacts are always going to be here. So let's think through that as part of the structure that we build for executing our impact assessments. We need to think from a business perspective. As we do, again, start with scoping and context, we need to realize that our business goals can and will evolve over time, which necessarily means that the scoping and context is likely going to evolve over time as well. And so as part of our drive to continually improve impact assessments, we need to continually reevaluate to ensure that those impacts that we're evaluating through this process are still in alignment with our overall business goals. That is, have we made significant changes to our AI system objectives? And lastly, changes to the thresholds for particular sensitive uses, restricted uses, impact scales. Again, those defined empirical metrics that we will be evaluating through the process. Now, in designing our AI impact assessment process, you'll see that we've got a basic structure of 12 fundamental things that we need to think through. You'll see in the next section, document 6, how we actually document this process as we're executing. But until then, until next time, thank you all so very much for your time.